The Lazy Tour of Two Idle Apprentices by Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins. Chapter 3. The Cumberland doctor's mention of Doncaster races inspired Mr. Francis Goodchild with the idea of going down to Doncaster to see the races. Doncaster, being a good way off, and quite out of the way of the idle apprentices, if anything could be out of their way who had no way, it necessarily followed that Francis perceived Doncaster in the race week to be, of all possible idleness, the particular idleness that would completely satisfy him. Thomas, with an enforced idleness grafted on the natural and voluntary power of his disposition, was not of this mind, objecting that a man compelled to lie on his back on a floor, a sofa, a table, a line of chairs, or anything he could get to lie upon, was not in racing condition, and that he desired nothing better than to lie where he was, enjoying himself in looking at the flies on the ceiling. But Francis Goodchild, who had been walking round his companion in a circuit of 12 miles for 2 days, and had begun to doubt whether it was reserved for him ever to be idle in his life, not only overpowered this objection, but even converted Thomas Idle to a scheme he formed, another idle inspiration, of conveying the said Thomas to the sea coast, and putting his injured leg under a stream of salt water. Plunging into this happy conception head foremost, Mr. Goodchild immediately referred to the country map, and ardently discovered that the most delicious piece of sea-coast to be found within the limits of England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, and the Channel Islands, all summed up together, was Albany, on the coast of Cumberland. There was the coast of Scotland opposite to Allenby, said Mr. Goodchild with enthusiasm. There was a fine Scottish mountain on that Scottish coast. There were Scottish lights to be seen shining across the glorious channel. And at Allenby itself there was every idle luxury, no doubt, that a watering place could offer to the heart of idle man. Moreover, said Mr. Goodchild, with his finger on the map, this exquisite retreat was approached by a coach road from a railway station called Aspatria, a name, in a manner, suggestive of the departed glories of Greece, associated with one of the most engaging and most famous of Greek women. On this point, Mr. Goodchild continued at intervals to breathe a vein of classic fancy and eloquence exceedingly irksome to Mr. Idle, until it appeared that the honest English pronunciation of that Cumberland country shortened Aspatria into Spatter. After this supplementary discovery, Mr. Goodchild said no more about it. By way of Spatter, the crippled idol was carried, hoisted, pushed, poked, and packed into and out of carriages, into and out of beds, into and out of tavern resting places, until he was brought, at length, within sniff of the sea. And now, behold the apprentices gallantly riding into Allenby in a one-horse fly, bent upon staying in that peaceful marine valley until the turbulent Doncaster time shall come round upon the wheel, in its turn among what are in sporting registers called the fixtures for the month. "Do you see Allenby?" asked Thomas Idle. "I don't see it yet," said Francis, looking out of window. "It must be there," said Thomas Idle. "I don't see it," returned Francis. "It must be there," repeated Thomas Idle fretfully. "Lord bless me," exclaimed Francis, drawing in his head. "I suppose this is it." "A watering place," retorted Thomas Idle, with the pardonable sharpness of an invalid. "Can't be 5 gentlemen in straw hats, on a form on one side of a door, and 4 ladies in hats and falls, on a form on another side of a door, and 3 geese in a dirty little brook before them, and a boy's legs hanging over a bridge, with a boy's body, I suppose, on the other side of the parapet, and a donkey running away. What are you talking about?" "Allenby, gentlemen," said the most comfortable of landladies as she opened one door of the carriage. "Allenby, gentlemen," said the most attentive of landlords as he opened the other. Thomas Idle yielded his arm to the ready Goodchild and descended from the vehicle. Thomas, now just able to grope his way along, in a doubled-up condition, with the aid of 2 thick sticks, was no bad embodiment of Commodore Trunnion, or of one of those many gallant admirals of the stage, who have all ample fortunes, gout, thick sticks, tempers, wards, and nephews. With this distinguished naval appearance upon him, Thomas made a crab-like progress up a clean little bulk-headed staircase into a clean little bulk-headed room, where he slowly deposited himself on a sofa, with a stick on either hand of him, looking exceedingly grim. "Francis," said Thomas Idle, "what do you think of this place?" "I think," returned Mr. Goodchild, in a glowing way, "it is everything we expected." "Ha!" said Thomas Idle. "There is the sea," cried Mr. Goodchild, pointing out of window, "and here," pointing to the lunch on the table, "are shrimps. Let us—" Here Mr. Goodchild looked out of window, as if in search of something, and looked in again. "Let us eat 'em." The shrimps eaten, and the dinner ordered, Mr. Goodchild went out to survey the watering place. As chorus of the drama, without whom Thomas could make nothing of the scenery, he by and by returned to have the following report screwed out of him. In brief, it was the most delightful place ever seen. "But," Thomas Idle asked, "where is it?" "It's what you may call generally up and down the beach, here and there," said Mr. Goodchild, with a twist of his hand. "Proceed," said Thomas Idle. "It was," Mr. Goodchild went on to say, in cross-examination, "what you might call a primitive place. Large? No, it was not large. Whoever expected it would be large? Shape? What a question to ask! No shape. What sort of a street? Why, no street. Shops? Yes, of course. Quite indignant. How many? Whoever went into a place to count the shops? Ever so many. 6? Perhaps. A library? Why, of course. Indignant again. Good collection of books? Most likely. Couldn't say. Had seen nothing in it but a pair of scales. Any reading room? Of course there was a reading room. Where? Where? Why, over there. Where was over there? Why, there. Let Mr. Idle carry his eye to that bit of waste ground above high water mark, where the rank grass and loose stones were most in a litter, and he would see a sort of long, ruinous brick loft next door to a ruinous brick outhouse, which loft had a ladder outside to get up by. That was the reading room, and if Mr. Idle didn't like the idea of a weaver's shuttle throbbing under a reading room, that was his lookout. He was not to dictate, Mr. Goodchild supposed, indignant again, to the company. "By the by," Thomas Idle observed, "the company? Well," Mr. Goodchild went on to report, "very nice company. Where were they? Why, they were here." Mr. Idle could see the tops of their hats, he supposed. What? Those 9 straw hats again. 5 gentlemen's and 4 ladies. Yes, to be sure. Mr. Goodchild hoped the company were not to be expected to wear helmets to please Mr. Idle. Beginning to recover his temper at about this point, Mr. Goodchild voluntarily reported that if you wanted to be primitive, you could be primitive here, and that if you wanted to be idle, you could be idle here. In the course of some days, he added, that there were 3 fishing boats, but no rigging, and that there were plenty of fishermen who never fished, that they got their living entirely by looking at the ocean. What nourishment they looked out of it to support their strength, he couldn't say, but he supposed it was some sort of iodine. The place was full of their children, who were always upside down on the public buildings, 2 small bridges over the brook, and always hurting themselves or one another, so that their wailings made more continual noise in the air than could have been got in a busy place. The houses people lodged in were nowhere in particular, and were in capital accordance with the beach, being all more or less cracked and damaged as its shells were, and all empty as its shells were. Among them was an edifice of destitute appearance, with a number of wall-eyed windows in it, looking desperately out to Scotland as if for help, which said it was a bazaar, and it ought to know, and where you might buy anything you wanted, supposing what you wanted was a little camp-stool or a child's wheelbarrow. The brook crawled or stopped between the houses and the sea, and the donkey was always running away, and when he got into the brook he was pelted out with stones, which never hit him, and which always hit some of the children who were upside down on the public buildings, and made their lamentations louder. This donkey was the public excitement of Allenby, and was probably supported at the public expense. The foregoing descriptions, delivered in separate items, on separate days of adventurous discovery, Mr. Goodchild severely wound up by looking out of window, looking in again, and saying, "But there is the sea, and here are the shrimps. Let us eat 'em." There were fine sunsets at Allenby, when the low, flat beach, with its pools of water and its dry patches, changed into long bars of silver and gold in various states of burnishing, and there were fine views, on fine days, of the Scottish coast. But when it rained at Allenby, Allenby, thrown back upon its ragged self, became a kind of place which the donkey seemed to have found out, and to have his highly sagacious reasons for wishing to bolt from. Thomas Idle observed, too, that Mr. Goodchild, with a noble show of disinterestedness, became every day more ready to walk to Maryport and back for letters, and suspicions began to harbour in the mind of Thomas that his friend deceived him, and that Maryport was a preferable place. Therefore, Thomas said to Francis, on a day when they had looked at the sea and eaten the shrimps, "My mind misgives me, Goodchild, that you go to Maryport, like the boy in the storybook, to ask it to be idle with you." "Judge then," returned Francis, adopting the style of the storybook, "with what success? I go to a region which is a bit of waterside Bristol, with a slice of Wapping, a seasoning of Wolverhampton, and a garnish of Portsmouth, and I say, 'Will you come and be idle with me?' And it answers, 'No, for I am a great deal too vaporous, and a great deal too rusty, and a great deal too muddy, and a great deal too dirty altogether, and I have ships to load, and pitch and tar to boil, and iron to hammer, and steam to get up, and smoke to make, and stone to quarry, and 50 other disagreeable things to do, and I can't be idle with you. Then I go into jagged uphill and downhill streets, where I am in the pastrycook's shop at one moment, and next moment in savage fastnesses of moor and morass, beyond the confines of civilization. And I say, to those murky and black dusty streets, 'Will you come and be idle with me?' To which they reply, 'No, we can't, indeed, for we haven't the spirits, and we are startled by the echo of your feet on the sharp pavement, and we have so many goods in our shop windows which nobody wants, and we have so much to do for a limited public which never comes to us to be done for, that we are altogether out of sorts, and can't enjoy ourselves with anyone. So I go to the post office, and knock at the shutter, and I say to the postmaster, 'Will you come and be idle with me?' To which he rejoins, 'No, I really can't, for I live, as you may see, in such a very little post office, and pass my life behind such a very little shutter, that my hand, when I put it out, is as the hand of a giant crammed through the window of a dwarf's house at a fair, and I am a mere post office anchorite in a cell much too small for him, and I can't get out, and I can't get in, and I have no space to be idle in, even if I would. So the boy, said Mr. Goodchild, concluding the tale, comes back with the letters after all, and lives happily never afterwards. But it may, not unreasonably, be asked, while Francis Goodchild was wandering hither and thither, storing his mind with perpetual observation of men and things, and sincerely believing himself to be the laziest creature in existence all the time, how did Thomas Idle, crippled and confined to the house, contrive to get through the hours of the day? Prone on the sofa, Thomas made no attempt to get through the hours, but passively allowed the hours to get through him. Where other men, in his situation, would have read books and improved their minds, Thomas slept and rested his body. Where other men would have pondered anxiously over their future prospects, Thomas dreamed lazily of his past life. The one solitary thing he did, which most other people would have done in his place, was to resolve on making certain alterations and improvements in his mode of existence, as soon as the effects of the misfortune that had overtaken him had all passed away. Remembering that the current of his life had hitherto oozed along in one smooth stream of laziness, occasionally troubled on the surface by a slight passing ripple of industry, his present ideas on the subject of self-reform included him, not, as the reader may be disposed to imagine, to project schemes for a new existence of enterprise and exertion, but, on the contrary, to resolve that he would never, if he could possibly help it, be active or industrious again throughout the whole of his future career. It is due to Mr. Idle to relate that his mind sauntered towards this peculiar conclusion on distinct and logically producible grounds. After reviewing, quite at his ease, and with many needful intervals of repose, the generally placid spectacle of his past existence, he arrived at the discovery that all the great disasters which had tried his patience and equanimity in early life had been caused by his having allowed himself to be deluded into imitating some pernicious example of activity and industry that had been set him by others. The trials, to which he here alludes, were 3 in number, and may be thus reckoned up. First, the disaster of being an unpopular and a thrashed boy at school. Secondly, the disaster of falling seriously ill. Thirdly, the disaster of becoming acquainted with a great bore. The first disaster occurred after Thomas had been an idle and a popular boy at school for some happy years. One Christmas time, he was stimulated by the evil example of a companion, whom he had always trusted and liked, to be untrue to himself, and to try for a prize at the ensuing half-yearly examination. He did try, and he got a prize. How, he did not distinctly know at the moment, and cannot remember now. No sooner, however, had the book, Moral Hints to the Young on the Value of Time, been placed in his hands, than the first troubles of his life began. The idle boys deserted him as a traitor to their cause. The industrious boys avoided him as a dangerous interloper. One of their number, who had always won the prize on previous occasions, expressing just resentment at the invasion of his privileges by calling Thomas into the playground, and then and there administering to him the first sound and genuine thrashing that he had ever received in his life. Unpopular, from that moment, as a beaten boy who belonged to no side and was rejected by all parties, young Idle soon lost caste with his masters, as he had previously lost caste with his schoolfellows. He had forfeited the comfortable reputation of being the one lazy member of the youthful community whom it was quite hopeless to punish. Never again did he hear the headmaster say reproachfully to an industrious boy who had committed a fault, "I might have expected this in Thomas Idle, but it is inexcusable, sir, in you, who know better. Nevermore, after winning that fatal prize, did he escape the retributive imposition or the avenging birch. From that time the masters made him work, and the boys would not let him play. From that time his social position steadily declined, and his life at school became a perpetual burden to him. So again with the second disaster. While Thomas was lazy, he was a model of health. His first attempt at active exertion and his first suffering from severe illness are connected together by the intimate relations of cause and effect. Shortly after leaving school, he accompanied a party of friends to a cricket field, in his natural and appropriate character of spectator only. On the ground, it was discovered that the players fell short of their required number, and facile Thomas was persuaded to assist in making up the complement. At a certain appointed time, he was roused from peaceful slumber in a dry ditch, and placed before 3 wickets with a bat in his hand. Opposite to him, behind 3 more wickets, stood one of his bosom friends, filling the situation, as he was informed, of bowler. No words can describe Mr. Idle's horror and amazement when he saw this young man, on ordinary occasions the meekest and mildest of human beings, suddenly contract his eyebrows, compress his lips, assume the aspect of an infuriated savage, run back a few steps, then run forward, and, without the slightest previous provocation, hurl a detestably hard ball with all his might straight at Thomas's legs. Stimulated to preternatural activity of body and sharpness of eye by the instinct of self-preservation, Mr. Idle contrived, by jumping deftly aside at the right moment, and by using his bat, ridiculously narrow as it was for the purpose, as a shield, to preserve his life and limbs from the dastardly attack that had been made on both, to leave the full force of the deadly missile to strike his wicket instead of his leg, and to end the innings, so far as his side was concerned, by being immediately bowled out. Grateful for his escape, he was about to return to the dry ditch when he was peremptorily stopped and told that the other side was going in, and that he was expected to field. His conception of the whole art and mystery of fielding may be summed up in the 3 words of serious advice which he privately administered to himself on that trying occasion: avoid the ball. Fortified by this sound and salutary principle, he took his own course, impervious alike to ridicule and abuse. Whenever the ball came near him, he thought of his shins and got out of the way immediately. "Catch it! Stop it! Pitch it up!" were cries that passed by him like the idle wind that he regarded not. He ducked under it, he jumped over it, he whisked himself away from it on either side. Never once through the whole innings did he and the ball come together on anything approaching to intimate terms. The unnatural activity of body which was necessarily called forth for the accomplishment of this result threw Thomas Idle, for the first time in his life, into a perspiration. The perspiration, in consequence of his want of practice in the management of that particular result of bodily activity, was suddenly checked. The inevitable chill succeeded, and that, in its turn, was followed by a fever. For the first time since his birth, Mr. Idle found himself confined to his bed for many weeks together, wasting and worn by long illness, of which his own disastrous muscular exertion had been the sole first cause. The third occasion on which Thomas found reason to reproach himself bitterly for the mistake of having attempted to be industrious was connected with his choice of a calling in life. Having no interest in the church, he appropriately selected the next best profession for a lazy man in England, the bar. Although the benches of the Inns of Court have lately abandoned their good old principles and obliged their students to make some show of studying, in Mr. Idle's time, no such innovation as this existed. Young men who aspired to the honourable title of barrister were, very properly, not asked to learn anything of the law, but were merely required to eat a certain number of dinners at the table of their hall, and to pay a certain sum of money, and were called to the bar as soon as they could prove that they had sufficiently compiled with these extremely sensible regulations. Never did Thomas move more harmoniously in concert with his elders and betters than when he was qualifying himself for admission among the barristers of his native country. Nor did he feel more deeply what real laziness was, in all the serene majesty of its nature, than on the memorable day when he was called to the bar, after having carefully abstained from opening his law books during his period of probation, except to fall asleep over them. How he could ever again have become industrious, even for the shortest period, after that great reward conferred upon his idleness, quite passes his comprehension. The kind benchers did everything they could to show him the folly of exerting himself. They wrote out his probationary exercise for him, and never expected him even to take the trouble of reading it through when it was written. They invited him, with 7 other choice spirits, as lazy as himself, to come and be called to the bar, while they were sitting over their wine and fruit after dinner. They put his oaths of allegiance and his dreadful official denunciations of the Pope and the Pretender so gently into his mouth that he hardly knew how the words got there. They wheeled all their chairs softly round from the table, and sat surveying the young barristers with their backs to their bottles, rather than stand up, or adjourn to hear the exercises read. And when Mr. Idle and the 7 unlabouring neophytes, ranged in order, as a class, with their backs considerately placed against the screen, had begun, in rotation, to read the exercises which they had not written, even then, each bencher, true to the great lazy principle of the whole proceeding, stopped each neophyte before he had stammered through his first line, and bowed to him, and told him politely that he was a barrister from that moment. This was all the ceremony. It was followed by a social supper, and by the presentation, in accordance with ancient custom, of a pound of sweetmeats and a bottle of Madeira, offered in the way of needful refreshment, by each grateful neophyte to each beneficent bencher. It may seem inconceivable that Thomas should ever have forgotten the great do-nothing principle instilled by such a ceremony as this, but it is, nevertheless, true that certain designing students of industrious habits found him out, took advantage of his easy humour, persuaded him that it was discreditable to be a barrister and to know nothing whatever about the law, and lured him, by the force of their own evil example, into a conveyancer's chambers to make up for lost time and to qualify himself for practice at the bar. After a fortnight of self-delusion, the curtain fell from his eyes. He resumed his natural character and shut up his books. But the retribution, which had hitherto always followed his little casual errors of industry, followed them still. He could get away from the conveyancer's chambers, but he could not get away from one of the pupils who had taken a fancy to him. A tall, serious, raw-boned, hard-working, disputatious pupil, with ideas of his own about reforming the law of real property, who had been the scourge of Mr. Idle's existence ever since the fatal day when he fell into the mistake of attempting to study the law. Before that time, his friends were all sociable idlers like himself. Since that time, the burden of bearing with a hard-working young man has become part of his lot in life. Go where he will now, he can never feel certain that the raw-boned pupil is not affectionately waiting for him round a corner to tell him a little more about the law of real property. Suffer as he may under the infliction, he can never complain, for he must always remember, with unavailing regret, that he has his own thoughtless industry to thank for first exposing him to the great social calamity of knowing a bore. These events of his past life, with the significant results that they brought about, pass drowsily through Thomas Idle's memory while he lies alone on the sofa at Ellenby and elsewhere, dreaming away the time which his fellow apprentice gets through so actively out of doors. Remembering the lesson of laziness which his past disasters teach, and bearing in mind also the fact that he is crippled in one leg because he exerted himself to go up a mountain when he ought to have known that his proper course of conduct was to stop at the bottom of it, he holds now, and will for the future firmly continue to hold, by his new resolution never to be industrious again, on any pretence whatever, for the rest of his life. The physical results of his accident have been related in a previous chapter. The moral results now stand on record, and, with the enumeration of these, that part of the present narrative, which is occupied by the episode of the sprained ankle, may now perhaps be considered, in all its aspects, as finished and complete. "How do you propose that we get through this present afternoon and evening?" demanded Thomas Idle, after 2 or 3 hours of the foregoing reflections at Allenby. Mr. Goodchild faltered, looked out of window, looked in again, and said, as he had so often said before, "There is the sea, and here are the shrimps. Let us eat 'em." But the wise donkey was at that moment in the act of bolting, not with the irresolution of his previous efforts, which had been wanting in sustained force of character, but with real vigour of purpose, shaking the dust off his mane and hind feet at Allenby, and tearing away from it, as if he had nobly made up his mind that he would never be taken alive. At sight of this inspiring spectacle, which was visible from his sofa, Thomas Idle stretched his neck and dwelt upon it rapturously. "Francis Goodchild," he then said, turning to his companion with a solemn air, "this is a delightful little inn, excellently kept by the most comfortable of landladies and the most attentive of landlords, but the donkey's right." The words, "There is the sea, and here are the—" again trembled on the lips of Goodchild, unaccompanied, however, by any sound. "Let us instantly pack the portmanteaus," said Thomas Idle, "pay the bill, and order a fly out, with instructions to the driver to follow the donkey." Mr. Goodchild, who had only wanted encouragement to disclose the real state of his feelings, and who had been pining beneath his weary secret, now burst into tears, and confessed that he thought another day in the place would be the death of him. So the 2 idle apprentices followed the donkey until the night was far advanced. Whether he was recaptured by the town council, or is bolting at this hour through the United Kingdom, they know not. They hope he may be still bolting. If so, their best wishes are with him. It entered Mr. Idle's head, on the borders of Cumberland, that there could be no idler place to stay at, except by snatches of a few minutes each, than a railway station. An intermediate station on a line, a junction, anything of that sort, Thomas suggested. Mr. Goodchild approved of the idea as eccentric, and they journeyed on and on, until they came to such a station where there was an inn. "Here," said Thomas, "we may be luxuriously lazy. Other people will travel for us, as it were, and we shall laugh at their folly." It was a junction station, where the wooden razors before mentioned shaved the air very often, and where the sharp electric telegraph bell was in a very restless condition. All manner of cross lines of rails came zigzagging into it, like a congress of iron vipers, and, a little way out of it, a pointsman in an elevated signal box was constantly going through the motions of drawing immense quantities of beer at a public-house bar. In one direction, confused perspectives of embankments and arches were to be seen from the platform. In the other, the rails soon disentangled themselves into 2 tracks and shot away under a bridge, and curved round a corner. Sidings were there, in which empty luggage vans and cattle boxes often butted against each other, as if they couldn't agree, and warehouses were there, in which great quantities of goods seemed to have taken the veil of the consistency of tarpaulin, and to have retired from the world without any hope of getting back to it. Refreshment rooms were there, one for the hungry and thirsty iron locomotives, where their coke and water were ready and of good quality, for they were dangerous to play tricks with. The other for the hungry and thirsty human locomotives, who might take what they could get, and whose chief consolation was provided in the form of 3 terrific urns or vases of white metal, containing nothing, each forming a breastwork for a defiant and apparently much injured woman. Established at this station, Mr. Thomas Idle and Mr. Francis Goodchild resolved to enjoy it, but its contrasts were very violent, and there was also an infection in it. First, as to its contrasts, they were only 2, but they were lethargy and madness. The station was either totally unconscious or wildly raving. By day, in its unconscious state, it looked as if no life could come to it, as if it were all rust, dust, and ashes, as if the last train forever had gone without issuing any return tickets, as if the last engine had uttered its last shriek and burst. One awkward shave of the air from the wooden razor, and everything changed. Tight office doors flew open, panels yielded, books, newspapers, travelling caps and wrappers broke out of brick walls. Money chinked. Conveyances oppressed by nightmares of luggage came cantering into the yard. Porters started up from secret places, ditto the much injured woman. The shining bell, who lived in a little tray on stilts by himself, flew into a man's hand and clamoured violently. The pointsman aloft in the signal box made the motions of drawing, with some difficulty, hogsheads of beer. Down train, more beer. Up train, more beer. Cross-junction train, more beer. Cattle train, more beer. Goods train, simmering, whistling, trembling, rumbling, thundering. Trains on the whole confusion of intersecting rails, crossing one another, bumping one another, hissing one another, backing to go forward, tearing into distance to come close. People frantic. Exiles seeking restoration to their native carriages and banished to remoter climes. More beer and more bell. Then, in a minute, the station relapsed into stupor as the stoker of the cattle train, the last to depart, went gliding out of it, wiping the long nose of his oil can with a dirty pocket handkerchief. By night, in its unconscious state, the station was not so much as visible. Something in the air, like an enterprising chemist's established in business on one of the boughs of Jack's beanstalk, was all that could be discerned of it under the stars. In a moment it would break out, a constellation of gas. In another moment, 20 rival chemists on 20 rival beanstalks came into existence. Then the Furies would be seen, waving their lurid torches up and down the confused perspectives of embankments and arches, would be heard, too, wailing and shrieking. Then the station would be full of palpitating trains as in the day, with the heightening difference that they were not so clearly seen as in the day, whereas the station walls, starting forward under the gas like a hippopotamus's eyes, dazzled the human locomotives with the sauce bottle, the cheap music, the bedstead, the distorted range of buildings where the patent safes are made, the gentleman in the rain with the registered umbrella, the lady returning from the ball with the registered respirator, and all their other embellishments. And now the human locomotives, creased as to their countenances and purblind as to their eyes, would swarm forth in a heap, addressing themselves to the mysterious urns and the much injured women, while the iron locomotives, dripping fire and water, shed their steam about plentifully, making the dull oxen in their cages, with heads depressed and foam hanging from their mouths as their red looks glanced fearfully at the surrounding terrors, seem as though they had been drinking at half-frozen waters and were hung with icicles. Through the same steam would be caught glimpses of their fellow travellers, the sheep, getting their white kid faces together away from the bars, and stuffing the interstices with trembling wool. Also, down among the wheels, of the man with the sledgehammer, ringing the axles of the fast night train, against whom the oxen have a misgiving that he is the man with the pole-axe, who is to come by and by, and so the nearest of them try to get back, and get a purchase for a thrust at him through the bars. Suddenly the bell would ring. The steam would stop with one hiss and a yell. The chemists on the beanstalks would be busy. The avenging furies would bestir themselves. The fast night train would melt from eye and ear. The other trains, going their ways more slowly, would be heard faintly rattling in the distance like old-fashioned watches running down. The sauce bottle and cheap music retired from view. Even the bedstead went to bed, and there was no such visible thing as the station to vex the cool wind in its blowing, or perhaps the autumn lightning as it found out the iron rails. The infection of the station was this. When it was in its raving state, the apprentices found it impossible to be there without labouring under the delusion that they were in a hurry. To Mr. Goodchild, whose ideas of idleness were so imperfect, this was no unpleasant hallucination, and accordingly that gentleman went through great exertions in yielding to it, and running up and down the platform, jostling everybody, under the impression that he had a highly important mission somewhere, and had not a moment to lose. But, to Thomas Idle, this contagion was so very unacceptable an incident of the situation, that he struck, on the fourth day, and requested to be moved. "This place fills me with a dreadful sensation," said Thomas, "of having something to do. Remove me, Francis." "Where would you like to go next?" was the question of the ever-engaging Goodchild. "I've heard there is a good old inn at Lancaster, established in a fine old house, an inn where they give you bride cake every day after dinner," said Thomas Idle. "Let us eat bride cake without the trouble of being married, or of knowing anybody in that ridiculous dilemma." Mr. Goodchild, with a lover's sigh, assented. They departed from the station in a violent hurry, for which, it is unnecessary to observe, there was not the least occasion, and were delivered at the fine old house at Lancaster on the same night. It is Mr. Goodchild's opinion that if a visitor, on his arrival at Lancaster, could be accommodated with a pole which would push the opposite side of the street some yards further off, it would be better for all parties. Protesting against being required to live in a trench, and obliged to speculate all day upon what the people can possibly be doing within a mysterious opposite window, which is a shop window to look at, but not a shop window in respect of its offering nothing for sale, and declining to give any account whatever of itself, Mr. Goodchild concedes Lancaster to be a pleasant place, a place dropped in the midst of a charming landscape, a place with a fine ancient fragment of castle, a place of lovely walks, a place possessing staid old houses, richly fitted with old Honduras mahogany, which has grown so dark with time that it seems to have got something of a retrospective mirror quality into itself, and to show the visitor, in the depths of its grain, through all its polish, the hue of the wretched slaves who groaned long ago under old Lancaster merchants. And Mr. Goodchild adds that the stones of Lancaster do sometimes whisper, even yet, of rich men passed away, upon whose great prosperity some of these old doorways frowned sullen in the brightest weather, that their slave grain turned to curses, as the Arabian wizard's money turned to leaves, and that no good ever came of it, even unto the third and fourth generations, until it was wasted and gone. It was a gallant sight to behold, the Sunday procession of the Lancaster elders to church, all in black, and looking fearfully like a funeral without the body, under the escort of 3 beadles. "Think," said Francis, as he stood at the inn window, admiring, "of being taken to the sacred edifice by 3 beadles. I have, in my early time, been taken out of it by 1 beadle, but to be taken into it by 3, oh, Thomas, is a distinction I shall never enjoy."